Today, I'm really excited to be talking to Steve Day, who is the Chief Procurement Officer at Kantar. Steve has been with the business since April 2020. He's previously held senior procurement roles in both Vodafone and Pearson. For those of you who are not familiar, Kantar is the world's leading data, insights and consulting company. And today I'm really excited to say we're talking to Steve specifically about his use of the Efficio CarbonCube, which, to summarise, is an extension of the Efficio SpendCube service, which we use to help organisations understand where they're spending money and with whom. And the CarbonCube follows the same principle, but helps organisations understand where their carbon emissions are coming from in their supply chain, or what's sometimes also referred to as their Scope 3 emissions. So, Steve, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation today. And although we're going to come on and talk specifically about carbon, I think we should probably start with just understanding a little bit about your journey. You obviously came into Kantar a number of years ago. I think it looked very different to how it looks as a procurement team now. So it would be great if we could start with your summary of that journey, really.
Thanks, Simon, and thank you for the opportunity to join you today. It's certainly been a journey. That's one way of describing it for sure. I joined in April 2020, the first week into lockdown, and didn't meet any of my real colleagues for over a year in person. So you can imagine how that kind of really challenged you to kind of get change management going. But in essence, I didn't inherit very much at Kantar. We've just recently been divested from WPP. The opportunities really three things. One is use data insights and analysis to guide where we needed to direct our procurement effort. Secondly, build our own procurement and category expertise. And then thirdly, there was a big opportunity to deploy technology at scale. And actually, as I speak to you today, within the next 2 weeks, we will have completed putting about 75% of Kantar spend into Cooper. And then there's three modules that we've used there. One's the contract module, one's the supplier onboarding, and the third is the classic P2P. So a lot of change in 3 years, really.
So, Steve, we're going to talk about carbon, I think, specifically in this conversation. So the obvious question is the starting question is, why is carbon an issue that you as the CPO of Kantar are looking at?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think a lot of procurement people are finding that the roles are expanding quite significantly beyond, dare I say, some of those traditional areas of procurement, like contract management, spend management, and all those kind of things. And at the heart of it is the reality, I think, that's dawning on a lot of organizations that, your supply chain, or your Scope 3, as many people refer to it, is representative of a very significant part of any business's carbon. And of course, where does that sit? Classically, that sits within your procurement organization. So, not unnaturally, I've come to this and began to start realizing it's a really important topic for procurement people to own. It's an opportunity for us maybe to nuance a little bit differently the value we can bring to the organization beyond some of those traditional things that I've said. And of course, who doesn't want to try and begin to start reorientating its businesses away from heavy intensive carbon suppliers into something that becomes more sustainable?
So, Steve, on the topic of carbon, I'm interested to understand, was it the board of directors within Kantar that are interested in this topic, and why? What's driven that?
Yeah, good question. I mean, firstly, we're owned by Bain Capital. They're the people that own the business. And they've made some very clear commitments in terms of what they want their portfolios to do. And one is evolve into a science-based target initiative. So we definitely have our shareholders very vested in this. But I might also add our clients as well. So, the work that we do is for some of the biggest consumer brands in the world. And, as part of their own due diligence into their own supply chain, they're increasingly asking the questions of Kantar that we in turn will ask our suppliers as well. And I think the third thing is, our employees and the type of people that we like to bring into the company and work with us. Increasingly people are thinking about the type of brands they want to work with, the affiliation of those brands, what those brands represent and what they do as well. So I think there's also a thirst on the part of our employee population, and I dare say future employees as well, that kind of want to work with those brands that are really leaning into this type of topic.
Yeah, And Steve, so if you're a CPO who's either been given the task of looking at Scope 3 or has volunteered to look at the issue of carbon and the Scope 3 emissions, where would you advise people even start? Seems like a difficult topic to tackle.
It's an incredible topic, really, in the sense that, first and foremost, recognizing my own lack of knowledge, I think it's something you really have to lean into and do your own research and learn. So that's, as people may have heard me say before, I think the thing that's marked out my career is that thirst for knowledge and learning. So I think that's, that's something that I guess we're all doing. The second thing, I think this is where it's a bit nuanced. And what I'm seeing a lot of people do is kind of begin to start inflating their carbon strategies and thinking about net neutrality and all those kind of things. But in truth, the thing that I think you need to do very quickly is get to a point where at least you can begin to start measuring what your Scope 3 looks like. And in fact, that's where the Efficio CarbonCube has definitely helped us do that. I would dare say it's helped us accelerate now thinking about getting into the richer conversations around what are the categories of spend and what's our category strategy is going to be. Because, someone said to me, it gave me a great phrase about procurement: you have all of the spend but none of the power. It's unimaginable that you can change a category strategy without engaging and aligning with your key stakeholders. And that's where I don't want to use the word battle, because that sounds like it's war or something like that.
Yeah.
But the truth is, really engaging with your stakeholders and really getting into the DNA of the categories that you're buying and how you're going to change the profile of demand or the type of supplies you buy for. That's really, really important. And what I would observe, delicately, I suppose, is there's an awful lot of effort going into very expansive ways of measuring it, not that much effort going into, so far as I can tell, actually thinking about carbon reduction strategies. And look, I mean, again, my own learning, initially I thought, well, it's fine, we'll just do carbon offset, we'll go and build a forest somewhere. But again, the regulations are becoming increasingly stringent on that type of thing. And that may have been an appropriate strategy several years ago, but now, we're really talking about actually reducing the carbon you generate, and that is not going to be a legitimate approach. So, it's a time to really crack on in those categories.
Yeah. So, Steve, the CarbonCube has given you ability to, in your words, kind of understand the problem, I suppose, and, what the measurements and the sizes of the issues. You also made a really interesting point about the move to action. Like, how have you taken that baseline of data and translated it into action? And I guess my follow-up question is, I think there's an assumption that still exists that actually, if you're going to tackle carbon, you're going to increase costs, which is, I don't know if that's true, but that's another interesting dynamic from us.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting. Let's deal with the second question first. People that say that tackling carbon is going to increase costs and things like that. The thing is, if you don't start dealing with it now, it's going to become much more of a bigger cost problem in the future.
Yeah.
That cost, it manifests its way in very subtle ways. So let me give you a Kantar example. We're privately owned at the moment. At some point in the future, potentially our owners may want to sell Kantar. Will be an IPO. The investment community that might be interested in buying Kantar's stock are really going to be interested not only in the value and the multiple and the business story of the company, but also its ESG credentials. And why? Because the pension funds themselves have signed up to commitments to their investors in turn that says we will only invest in assets to meet a certain criteria. Now, you can imagine, a company like Kantar that doesn't have a story to tell and a strategy versus in that regard, suddenly we're going to face a lot more expensive financing options. So I think you've got to look really broadly at the cost I mentioned, Simon, beyond just, is my like-for-like price going to shift or change? So that's the first point. But even beyond that, if I think of day-to-day costs and things like that, I think it's definitely the case that we're in a transition. I think carbon-emitting categories of spend will undoubtedly become more expensive over time because the regulation around all of those products and services will increasingly get taxed. So, for me, any sense that, a carbon neutral strategy is more expensive is really just a transitionary thing. It's not going to be there forever. Turning to a good category of spend, just to illustrate the differences here, one of the things our business does is reach out to people in this audience perhaps and get your opinions on brands and services. And we do that through incentives. So we have a number of platforms where people will sign on to our solutions, and you will be asked questions periodically for which you'll get some kind of incentive and reward. Yeah, historically, those incentives and rewards were the accumulation of points that you could exchange for things like toasters or kettles or things like that. And what we're now doing is evolving that into platforms where actually you accumulate, for example, Netflix points or Apple points or content choices. So you can actually begin to digest and consume content that doesn't cost you anything because you've earned it through the incentive schemes that Kantar's made. And you could see a very obvious shift, therefore, in terms of the carbon strategy of incentives versus moving to a content one. And of course, I'm sure people will be saying, yeah, but Steve, don't forget, you've got massive data centers that are then propagating this content data around the world, and they themselves create data. And indeed, that's the case. But don't forget, Netflix, Apple, they've all got very aggressive net neutral strategies themselves. In fact, we're doing this recording in September. If anyone's looked on LinkedIn recently, Apple have just done a really clever piece of advertising talking about their own ESG strategy. So, I would argue that we're definitely aligning ourselves behind categories of spend in companies that are definitely moving in this direction.
Yeah. And Steve, so from your experience of working with Efficio on the CarbonCube and more generally in terms of this topic, are there any key points, takeaways, learnings that you would highlight to other CPOs around this area?
And it's a good story. It's a good story. It's my good story. Whether it's interesting for people or not to listen to, that fact remains. But we started from a place of an awful lot of immaturity. And what we initially launched was the eFlow Spend Analytics Dashboard, and that for the first time gave Kantar real currency over who it was spending its dollars with, who those suppliers with, where they were around the world, et cetera, et cetera. Really easy. I suppose this is the advertising bit now. Very easy for us to deploy. Didn't cost a fortune. And for the first time, when we were acquired by Bain, we're able to steer the ship in terms of where our third-party spend was. For us, it was a very happy path to work with Efficio to then use the CarbonCube functionality that was adjacent to the eFlow capability to begin to start measuring for the first time, what carbon our categories of spend were emitting. And that was to some degree leveraging on the kind of knowledge cube you built yourselves based on those categories. And it's been super useful because, as I say, we've definitely spent time, of course, working on getting better visibility. But now the more interesting topic from my perspective is now how we take that data and begin to start working with the business to define what our science-based target initiatives are going to be, and then really get to the business I've said of working through how we're going to get to net neutrality. So yeah.
Steve, it seems like an appropriate place to draw the conversation to a conclusion. Really interesting to hear about your journey and to hear the huge work you've done in taking the agenda of carbon and Scope 3 emissions forward in Kantar. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
And thank you for people watching. If you would like to understand more about the Efficio CarbonCube, then please go to the Efficio website and search CarbonCube. And thanks very much for watching.